and that way those of you and all your esteemed colleagues and friends will be able to access it after the call if they weren't available now. The way that we're going to do it is we're going to learn about 15 minutes each from Rabbi Marmur and from Gershom Gorenberg, and at the end we'll have time for questions and for some brief discussion. What I'm going to ask you to do is to save questions that can be submitted either to me in the chat function and can be submitted over email at ARZA at arza.org, ARZA at arza.org. We will compile the questions and then feed them to our speakers. With that, having said that, I'd like to turn it over to Rabbi Janet Liss, the chair of the CCAR Israel Committee, to introduce Rabbi Marmur.
Thank you, Josh. It is a privilege for me to introduce Dr. Michael Marmur, who has previously served as Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of HUC in Jerusalem. In recent years, he's taught courses in theology, homiletics, and pluralistic Jewish education. Dr. Marmur was born and raised in England. He completed a BA in modern history at University of Oxford before moving to Israel in 1984. While studying for an MA in ancient Jewish history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, he completed his studies in the Israeli Rabbinic program of HUC Jerusalem, becoming ordained in 1992. For 6 years following his ordination, he served as a congregational rabbi, high school teacher, and member of the executive at the Leo Beck Education Center in Haifa. Dr. Marmur's PhD dissertation at Hebrew University in Jerusalem was entitled Heschel's Rhetoric of Citation, the Use of Sources in God in the Search of Man. Rabbi Marmur has lectured and taught extensively both in the States and in Israel and in many parts of Western and Central Europe. He's married to Sarah Bernstein and has 3 children. And he was awarded his PhD from Hebrew U in 2006. Michael is no stranger to us. We really appreciate hearing from you basically at every CCAR conference and every summer sermon call. So welcome to you, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Well, every conference and every sermon call, you guys should mix it up a bit, is my suggestion. It's a great pleasure to be with you folks. This is not going to be a sermon. The purpose of the next few minutes is to try and give you as many materials, as many directions, if you like, as many dead ends and false avenues that you can explore before going back and coming up with the sermon that you wanted. The first thing I want to point out, which is true every year, of course, is how difficult this business is. For many of our colleagues, the idea of there being the Israel sermon has been a staple of their rabbinates. Although I dare say that's a difference generationally. I'm not sure it's so true of our younger colleagues. But I wonder whether the whole business of the Israel sermon, the idea that Israel is somehow this discrete topic, which has nothing to do with all of the other pressing issues of the day, I wonder if that has served us so well. And so one of the things you might want to consider is not necessarily what do I say in my Israel sermon this year, but rather to what degree do some of the issues that those who love and care about Israel, those who feel that they have skin in the game and are passionately engaged, to what extent do the issues that arise as one considers Israel 50 years after the 67 war, to what degree would they inform, change, relate to one's views about some of the big questions of life? I've been very taken recently with the difference between myths and facts. I keep on reminiscing when I was a child growing up in England, the Israeli embassy would produce a booklet called Myths and Facts, very conveniently. On one side of the page were myths. Those are all the things that the enemies of Israel said. And on the other side were facts. Those were all the true things you needed to know, which would somehow inure you or inoculate you against the terrible myths that were being perpetrated. And what I've since learned over the years is that there are myths in the world and there are facts, but the relationship between them is not as was represented in that rather banal graphic all those years ago. In fact, what we all do is we find facts, choose facts, eke out facts in the world, and they inform the myths that we make. Myths, far from being lies, there are lies. People tell lies all the time. But I'm now talking about myths. Myths, in a sense, are the ways in which we organize our facts. They also, of course, encourage us to look at certain facts and to put other facts into the background. So to be explicit or specific about Israel for the time being, you might ask this question: which individual who has been in the news in Israel and around the world this year will be at the focus of your myth and at the focus of your sermon? Is it Hallel Yafa Ariel, slain in her bed by a Palestinian terrorist? Is it Elor Azaria, the soldier who put a bullet through the head of the young Palestinian terrorist lying on the ground in Hebron? Is it Shira Banki, the yahrzeit of whom the anniversary of whose death has just been marked in these recent weeks, as slain as she was at the Pride March here in Jerusalem last year? In a sense, there are facts connected to all of these people, but the facts you choose to dwell on and the way we choose to understand those facts and relate to them, of course, says much about what are our most profound myths. What are the big stories we tell ourselves and anybody who's prepared to listen about Israel, life, the world, and all the rest of it. So myths and facts, that was one thing I wanted to say. Here's another disconnected thing I want to say. Preparing for today's call, I listened to a podcast by Michael Sandel, the philosopher. It's in a series called The Public Philosopher. And this was one from May 2014 on national guilt. And it is a remarkable broadcast. I'd recommend anyone to download it and listen to it. There are young people from Japan, China, and North Korea who are talking about the relationships between their countries. And along the way, here are the issues that come out in the discourse: history, patriotism, complicity, apology, forgiveness, responsibility. By actually, as we would say in Hebrew, harchakat edut, by going to another context and listening to people talking about their national narratives, their myths and their facts, if you like, I found it both very moving but also very informative. Thinking about the question, what does it mean for Israelis? What does it mean for people who care about Israel, wherever they are in the world, to consider the interrelationship between our myths and our facts and those of the peoples around the Palestinian people in particular, but those around us in this crazy Middle East which we inhabit. The next thing I want to say is that it's been noted here that I teach homiletics, but my real passion, the thing for which I am a real connoisseur, is the bad sermon. I have heard, and God knows, delivered any number of bad sermons. The title of that book, it wasn't a book, it was a podcast that I just mentioned called The Public Philosopher. Bad sermons are a great delicacy as far as I'm concerned. And I just want to give voice to the fact that wherever you stand on the spectrum of positions relating to Israel, it's more than possible to deliver the humdinger of a bad sermon. If you are in the camp, a camp which apparently, according to the press of the last couple of days, seems to be growing in size, of those people who used to be enamored of Israel, but have now decided that all the myths of their adolescence have failed them, and Israel is no longer something that they can identify with or be connected to, then you know the bad sermon you're going to hear, right? It's one of youthful hope that is dashed on the shore of grim realpolitik. If you're in another group within the amongst our congregants and colleagues for whom Israel is simply too hot to handle and too difficult to relate to, then the bad sermon I'm thinking of is one that will mention every presenting issue you can possibly think about on the North American agenda or out there in the world, but somehow Israel, that which seems to me by any account, a compelling major drama of the Jewish people playing out in our day, somehow that doesn't make it into the catalogue. You have folks who, in my camp, people who are struggling and wrestling with Israel, who are also capable of giving really astonishingly bad sermons. You know the kind. On the one hand, it's bad. On the other hand, it's good. Your poor congregants, your listeners, they wonder at the end of it, well, they agonized. It may have been therapeutic for them, but what did they tell me which I can somehow grow from and use? And then, of course, there's the tub-thumping sermon of the great defender of Israel, who knows axiomatically that everything that the government of Israel does is, by definition, grand and tremendous, and it's only anti-Semitic plots which suggest otherwise. And we've all heard versions of that kind of bad sermon too. So it's easy and flippant, of course, to identify all the risks. What do we actually do when we want to address some of the core themes of this period of the High Holy Days and relate to the realities of contemporary Israel? There's an accompanying text which you have the logo for before you, and we're not going to, in the few minutes I have left, try to gallop through all of these various texts, but let me tell you what I've provided for you that you might find interesting. If we scroll down a little here, Josh, I'm relying on your, there you go. So this term, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, interesting that Mishkan HaNefesh confidently ascribes it to Agnon. The other opinions are that it was actually Herzog, the grandfather of Buzzi Herzog, who claimed responsibility for putting that term into the blessing. But this notion of the first flowering of our redemption, I brought you here a rough translation of a little essay by Yuval Sherlow from the Zohar site, in which he says, you know, maybe Israel is not Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, maybe it isn't the first flowering of our redemption, but here's a list of reasons of why we must continue to think of it as something significant and worthwhile. The text from Sikta Rabati is one that caught my eye the other day, and that I think is kind of fascinating, particularly if, like me, what you try to do when preaching about Israel is give people room to breathe. Rather than just harangue them with a particular view, try and give folks a context or a paradigm within which they can try to make sense of what's going on. So here you have a discussion of teshuvah in this midrash, in which there are 5 things which bring redemption. One of them is tzara, that it's actually suffering, which redeems in some way. The other is ketz and acharit hayamim, the end of days. Then you have this third commodity of teshuvah, and then there's rachamim, mercy, and zchut avot, the merit of the ancestors. It just struck me as I was reading this, how many within Israeli society seem to fixate on one or other of these issues. Leave teshuvah aside for a moment. But you have those for whom the story of Israel is an unending story of hardship. You have others who are convinced that what's playing out at the moment is the end time. It's some extraordinary messianic happy ending to all the woes of the universe. You have those who are only prepared to see what's taking place in Israel, on the West Bank and everywhere else, through the prism, if you like, of mercy. And here I want to say, looking at the suffering of the other, of the downtrodden other, and considering their fate. And then lastly, zchut avot, you have in Israeli society today a remarkable turn towards tradition understood in a variety of different ways. And it just struck me that putting teshuvah at the heart of this model and asking, what does it mean to be engaged in a process of teshuvah so that one's myths and one's facts are able to encompass what is a complex reality? Let's move down the page, if we would, because time is not on our side. I was interested in this notion of the 50 years, an obvious connection between 50 years since the 67 war and the motif in Yom Kippur of the Yovel, of the Jubilee, of the 50th year. And I brought you from Bachya a really interesting reading of how a generation is like an olam, an entire world, and in both cases, that's 50 years. And I was reflecting on the fact for how many people the reality of our presence on the West Bank is not some memory from the middle of their adult life. It's just a question of what generation you belong to. But by the time you have 50 years, for many people, this reality, call it the occupation if you like, is their olam, is their world, is their universe of discourse and reality. It's no longer a brand new thing that's just burst onto the scene. And so I brought you, we can go down the page, some sources which relate to this idea of 50 years. Rachel Elior has done remarkable work about numbers and ways of understanding years, and how the 50th year, the Jubilee year, plays into this system of sevens. Again, I'm just alluding to it now. If you get interested in 50 as a thing you want to play with, I was just trying to give you a few leads there. And if we continue, I found this really interesting in Masechet Yoma in the Babylonian Talmud. You know, there's a question as to whether a synagogue needs a mezuzah. And actually, a synagogue doesn't need a mezuzah, so the Talmud tells us, unless you have somebody living there, right? Unless there's an accommodation. And then they make a distinction between a public mezuzah and a private mezuzah. And it's said that a private mezuzah in your home, you should make a business of checking twice every 7 years. Pa'amayim b'shavua. Shavua here means, you'll be pleased to know, 7 years and not 7 days. Shel Rabim, a mezuzah shel Rabim, something that speaks to the community as a whole. Twice every 50 years, you should re-examine it. And it just struck me that we commonly are checking our mezuzah shel Rabim and seeing what it has meant for the Jewish people, for Jewish ethics, for the state of Israel, to have been in this situation for these last 5 decades. The next section here involves texts relating to struggle and conquest, and I was interested in the word kibush, which, of course, in the Israeli context is used often by people with one set of myths and facts to describe the story of the last 50 years, and how kibush ha'aretz is likened, for example, in some of these Hasidic sources, to kibush, to conquering one's yetzer. I'm altogether fascinated by the psychological and spiritual implications of what these last 50 years have meant for the Israeli psyche, for the Jewish psyche, and what it means to be in charge of land and people in the way that that we have been these last decades. If you just scroll to the down to the end, again, we're not going to read all of these texts now. Anybody who has any questions about any of the sources that I brought, please feel free to be in touch. I'd be happy to discourse with you about them. And then at the bottom of these pages altogether, Josh, you're nearly there. Just keep going. Keep going. Don't be shy. There's more. Yes, we made it. I have some of the names that I mentioned, Elora Azaria and Hallel Ariel. I didn't mention Shirabondi here. And I've got links to to sites which, in my opinion, explicate how your myths inform your facts and how your facts determine your myths. I'm at the end of my time in this initial thing. I want to say that I don't think the question for you and for me, as I consider what I'm going to speak to the Jews about in this High Holy Days, is which clever source one brings or even which position one adopts. Rather, the question is, how can one be true to the spirit of the Yamim Noraim, of a call for radical honesty in a period in which most of you are caught between what you feel you can say, the price you're going to pay for for adopting a strong position, or maybe the confusion you feel about having any strong position at all. Is one lending succor to the enemies of Israel, or is one being a succor and playing into the party line? How does one find a way? And I think that for me, it's much more about the tone you strike. Can you speak with vision and passion and honesty and self-critique, rather than which particular vort do you bring, or even which particular position do you take? Now, the last thing I want to say, and then I'll shut up for a while, is that I know it's tempting when one talks about myths to decline into a kind of postmodern discourse in which there are no facts at all, and it's all just a matter of narrative. I don't think that's true. I know that there are real questions of, Israel is sometimes presented, the actions of Israel are sometimes presented either as heinous, demonic examples of the worst cases of inhumanity, or as shining exemplars of the ultimate in human interaction. I think one of the tasks we face, and one of the burdens, if you like, we have, if we're going to be responsible Jewish people in the 21st century, is not simply to reach for those facts and myths, or those facts which suit our myths, and not only to reach for a kind of facile discourse in which all the complexities of the situation order themselves up very nicely. I know that it's tempting to come out with the great answer, but believe me, it's not so clear what that great answer is, and I tend to be very suspicious of the people who know or have got it all sorted out for themselves. But if we can speak with honesty and integrity and passion and involvement and connection, then we have an opportunity to share our myths and our facts with the people who still, for some reason, want to show up and listen to us.
Toda rabba v'yishar koach. Thank you, Michael, for offering us those text thoughts, and I think more important than either of those are questions that you led us to think about, and I'm sure we'll take those into internalize. I want to encourage everyone to begin thinking of questions for Rabbi Marmur and to jot them down, send them to me via chat. Just a reminder of the chat that you can identify who to send it to, or you can send it to everyone. The chokhmah there is to know which. So again, thank you, and we're going to now move on, and it's a pleasure to invite Rabbi John Rossoff of Temple Israel of Hollywood and the chair of ARZA to introduce Gershom Gorenberg.
Thank you. Can you see me? I don't know if I've got, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes and yes.
Yes and yes? Okay. First, Michael, you never disappoint, and you have certainly not disappointed today. Your presentation was outstanding, and thank you. There's a lot to look at in the text you presented, and I am personally grateful because this is something that I'm one of those people that always speaks about Israel. And this helps me frame the tumult that I'm having in my own heart and soul as to what I do this year. So I'm deeply appreciative. Gershom, it's great to see you again. I don't know if you remember, but your sister Carol was a congregant of mine in San Francisco years ago, and it's good to see you. So it's my honor to introduce Gershom Gorenberg, who is the author of The Unmaking of Israel. And if someone can turn off their sound, that would be helpful. The Unmaking of Israel, which was published by HarperCollins in 2011, is a provocative examination of Israeli history that describes the crisis of Israeli democracy and lays out a vision for the country's future. Until I read The Unmaking of Israel, says novelist Michael Chabon, I didn't think it could be possible to feel more despairing and then more terribly hopeful about Israel. His previous book is The Accidental Empire, Israel and the Birth of the Settlements, 1967 to 77. The New York Times called it remarkably insightful, a groundbreaking revision that deserves to reframe the entire debate. Gershom is a senior correspondent for the American Prospect and a columnist for Haaretz. He has written for the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times Magazine, the New York Review of Books and Foreign Policy, and has twice been a visiting professor at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Gershom made Aliyah from California in 1977. He has an MA in Jewish education from the Hebrew University and served for many years as a reservist in the IDF Education Corps. He now lives in Jerusalem. Since the publication of The Accidental Empire, Gershom has established himself as the foremost historian of the Jewish settlement activity in the territories acquired in the Six-Day War 50 years ago. He has also established himself as a religious voice of peace. Those are the reasons we wanted him to teach to us on this call. And Gershom, we're honored to have you with us, and it's good to see you again, and it's all yours. B'vakasha.
Thank you very much for having me. I know this is a tough subject. I had a guest at my Shabbat table in Jerusalem recently when I said something about the Israel conversation in the United States. He told me the following story. He said, it's after Friday night services, and Cohen and Levy say hello to each other, and then there's a couple of moments of silence, and then Cohen sighs, and then Levy says, I thought we agreed we weren't going to talk about Israel. So I know this is a subject that causes tension and that confuses. I can't do anything about the tension. I can say that if you're confused, it's a good sign. And if you're not yet confused, I hope to confuse you in the few minutes that I have here. So I'm going to do a little bit of history on one foot. In the professional jargon of historians, there's something called periodization, which means how do we divide history into chapters. So my personal periodization of Israeli history consists of either 3 or 4 periods. The pre-state period, the struggle for independence and self-determination, what I call the First Israeli Republic from 1948 to 1967, the Accidental Empire since 1967, and the Second Israeli Republic, dates to be announced depending on political developments. But the most interesting thing for me about these chapters are the transitions. So the first transition is between chapter 1 to 2, which of course took place not 50, but almost 70 years ago on May 14th, 1948, with the declaration of the state, which a couple things, even though we all know about this, I want to stress a couple qualities of this. First of all, it was the realization of the basic goal of a revolutionary political movement, Zionism, a national liberation movement. Jews defined as a nation, as an ethnic group, achieved political independence in part of their historic homeland and created a country where they would be the majority and shape the culture of the public square. Self-determination, not as a mythic event, not as the coming of the Messiah, but as a pragmatic, this worldly achievement. When we talk about it being a Jewish state, here I have to stress again, the meaning of a Jewish state in the classic Zionist and Israeli meaning is that it is parallel to Czech Republic, not Islamic Republic. That is to say, it is a state of the Jewish nation, of the Jewish ethnic community. Another aspect of this is that independence was possible only through partition of the land, which was intended to be partitioned between 2 national groups who have a historic claim to the same homeland. Now, significant groups on both the Jewish right and the Jewish left rejected the idea of partition. And one aspect of founding Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion's greatness was to accept the idea of partition. Now, of course, partition didn't come as it was planned. It was not peaceful. The Arab state was not created. The armistice lines of 1949, otherwise known as the Green Line, are not the partition lines. Nonetheless, the acceptance of division created the state. In the Knesset in April 1949, after the signing of the armistice with Transjordan that left the West Bank under Arab rule, Ben-Gurion said, when the question arose of having the entire land without a Jewish state, or a Jewish state without the entire land, we chose a Jewish state without the entire land. And the last thing I would mention about this was, again, it was a victory for a revolutionary movement. And in my view, if there's one thing in the life of a revolutionary that is much more difficult than defeat, it is victory. Because when a revolution succeeds, the revolutionary has to become what I would call an institutionary. the rebels have to become bureaucrats and politicians, and the law, which used to be somebody else's, is now your own. And if we look around the world at the baby boomer states, all the countries that became independent after World War II, Israel handled this transition remarkably well. Certainly not perfectly, but it is the only one of those countries that has remained continuously a parliamentary democracy. And in the first 19 years, what I call the first Israeli Republic, there was a slow, unsteady creation of a democratic republic. Imperfect, 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back, but that was what was going on. The second turning point is the June 1967 Six-Day War. The war was unplanned. The conquest of the Gaza Strip, the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights were unexpected. That's why I call it the accidental empire. And after the war, immediately after the war, even before the fighting stopped, really, the question arose of what should be the policy about that land. Should we keep it? Should we give it back? If we keep it, what should we do? The Israeli cabinet under Prime Minister Levi Eshkol met for 2 straight days. Can you imagine 2 days of Jews meeting endlessly? It must have been a misery. For 2 straight days, a week after the war, and virtually every minister proposed something else for what should be the future of the territories, and particularly the West Bank. So for instance, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan proposed that Israel keep permanent rule of the West Bank, that it give local autonomy, home rule to the Arabs living there, but not Israeli citizenship. And in response to that, the strongest response to that came from Justice Minister Yaakov Shimshon Shapira. And now I'm quoting from the, the long classified minutes of that cabinet meeting. Shapira said, "In a time of decolonialization, when we are unjustly accused of colonialism, can we even consider the idea of a territory in which mainly Arabs live and defense and foreign policy will be in our hands? Every progressive person will rise against us and say, they want to turn the West Bank into a colony." And on the other hand, he said, if we keep the land and we give the Arab residents the vote, he said, quote, "we're done with the Zionist enterprise," unquote, because you'd have a binational state, not a Jewish state. No decision was made. In fact, Levi Eshkol later told President Lyndon Johnson, "My government has decided not to decide." But politics doesn't suffer a vacuum, and those who have some idea of what they want, particularly those who wanted to keep part or all of the land, took gradual action. And that action, there's 2 major elements of that action. One was the creation of settlements. The first Israeli settlement in occupied territory was established 5 weeks after the 1967 war, a secular kibbutz in the Golan Heights. By the time the Labor Party lost power in 1977, 10 years later, there were nearly 80 settlements in the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan, and the Sinai. And the process, of course, from then was greatly speeded up by the Likud. Today, there are approximately 560,000 Israelis living over the Green Line in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and about another 45,000 in the Golan Heights. Those are the most recent figures via the Central Bureau of Statistics of the Israeli government. I'd like to clear up a couple of misconceptions, common misconceptions about those settlements. One is that settlement is an Orthodox project imposed on the secular majority, and therefore the debate about settlement can be mapped on the other great Israeli debate between secularism and religion. The reality is that settlement has been the policy of successive secular-dominated governments since 1967, and I would describe the religious settlers, a minority of the settlers, as the unruly clients of those governments. Another misconception, which frankly I find a little bit bizarre, but I run into every time I visit America, is that most settlers are Americans. This is completely untrue. Of all of the Israelis living in the West Bank, approximately 11% were born in Europe or the Americas, and that includes Russians, Argentinians, etc. If you want to know why it seems that they're all Americans, it's because when the news crew goes out there with the microphone, they look for somebody who speaks English. And finally, there's a misconception that settlements were built as bargaining chips with the possibility built into the plan of taking them down. I've looked at the papers on the decisions of setting up settlements from the start, Every settlement was planned to be permanent. The goal was to predetermine borders, to keep either part or the entirety of occupied territory. The second major element of that creeping process was legal changes, the gradual application, partial application through military decisions and legislation of Israeli law to Israelis living in the West Bank. And the most important element of that is allowing Israelis living in the West Bank to vote where they live. Israel has no voter registration and no absentee ballot. By being a citizen, you are registered to vote in your nearest precinct, but you have to be there to vote. Somebody outside the borders of the state on election day can't vote, with some very small exceptions like diplomats. But from 1969, from the first national election after the Six-Day War, Israelis living in settlements in occupied territory voted in precincts in their settlements. The most succinct description of why this is a problem in the years that I've covered the subject, which are many, came from Dan Meridor, a Likud politician, when he was the intelligence minister in a Likud-led government in 2011. And he said, I grew up on the vision of the whole land of Israel. He said, but I changed my mind because, quote, in Hebron, Jews vote and Arabs don't. We shouldn't have a state without equality. In my view, the effect of this has been a corrosion of the state and of democracy, a blurring of our borders, an area which a democratic state rules, but which is not under democratic rule in that territory. At the same time, there's been all sorts of developments over those 50 years that have made Israel more democratic. The press has become freer. The Supreme Court has taken a greater role in enforcing human rights. If somebody asked me to write a novel, an allegorical novel about Israel, my main character would be a very successful artist who has a substance abuse problem. And then if you asked me, is she a success or a failure, success or a failure, and I'd have to say yes. Which is to say, countries like people by their contradictions. I've just given an analogy, but I have to say that I would also warn you against analogies, against applying the categories from elsewhere to what's happening in Israel. My son said to me one time, analogies are misleading because they equate something you don't understand with something you do understand, so you think that you understand it. Even when you still don't. For instance, a very common analogy is to call what's going on in Israel apartheid, or to compare it to Jim Crow. It's not those things. It's different. It's a problem, but it's not those things. It's the specific problem of Israel. One of the reasons it's not those things, it's the issue at stake is not just the individual rights of citizens, one person, one vote. That's an issue, but it's not the only one. A issue in which that is framed is that both groups, Jews and Palestinians, want collective rights as national groups. They each want self-determination. That is to say, they want to be independent and to have their own nation state. I would also say that it's important to remember that the ongoing conflict is not the fault of one side alone. There are many people who would say that it is, although they would disagree on which side. I've described Israeli internal politics because that's my specialty, but just to mention one major error on the Palestinian side was the massive strategic error of the Second Intifada, which convinced a large portion of the Israeli public that peace was impossible. Nonetheless, it would appear to me that partition is still essential for Israel to be a democracy with Jewish self-determination. Ending the occupation is a means toward the second Israeli Republic. That doesn't mean I have any instant solutions for how to get there, but I think it should be Israel's strategic goal. That is to say, the Zionist goal is negotiated repartition. And I'd like to finish with a thought as a political historian and as a religious Jew. And it's an idea that I came to after reading and studying a novel by Isaac Bashevis Singer called The Family Moskowitz. Family Moskowitz is one of those great sprawling social novels about the last generation of Polish Jewry. And Singer published it in 3 languages, in Yiddish and in English and in Hebrew. The amazing thing is, in each of those languages, the book has a different ending. For instance, in the English version, it ends with the Nazis on the verge of entering Warsaw, and one Jew saying to the other, the Messiah is coming, death is the Messiah. Totally nihilistic ending. In the Yiddish version, that's happening, but Chalutzim, young Zionist pioneers, are escaping through the forest to reach Eretz Yisrael, and the Yiddish practically becomes Hebrew in a completely different kind of messianic tone. And in the Hebrew version, they're also escaping, but it's all very down to earth and practical. The thing about those three endings is they change the meaning of everything that's happened in the book up to then. You will remember every detail in a different way because of the ending. Or, to put it differently, each new chapter written literally changes all the chapters before. Each new chapter we write in our lives as individuals or as a people or as a country changes the meaning of what came before that. In a sense, actually changes the past. So the meaning of the last 50 years and of the last 70 years depends on the chapter that we write next. Thank you.
Everyone is applauding on mute right now, just so you know. Gershom, thank you so much for that eye-opening and very informative, what I'll call is a summary and an introduction that I think leaves us with much food for thought. I want to invite Michael Marmur to join us back again and to remind everyone that this is now the time that we have to submit questions, comments, thoughts. A word, just so everyone knows, this is being recorded, so if you missed something or have a specific clarifying question, you can refer back to the link that we'll send out after the call. I want to pose two different questions, one to Gershom and one to Rav Marmur, and then we'll let each respond in turn. And of course, feel free, either of you, to respond to the question that was destined for the other. Of course, as if we champion pluralism here, then we're good with the answers. For Gershom, basing on your talk, that you champion essentially the notion of partition, or for common language, the two-state solution, as really the only solution for the Zionist approach, given that there are, some say 300,000, some say up to 500,000, you can correct us on the facts here, settlers living beyond the Green Line. How does that play out? How is withdrawal from those territories actually viable without a civil war, based on looking to the story of now 11 years ago in Gaza? And what do people actually mean when they say a one-state solution? How does that play out as well? That's question number one for Gershom Gorenberg. And to Michael Marmur, I want to pose the question that came in from Rabbi Lawrence Groffman. The question of what do we do with the idea that there are different myths and facts beyond acknowledging that we choose the facts that fit our myths, of course, and vice versa? Is the idea to challenge our congregants to be honest about their own Israel myths? If so, then what is the message, and what are we asking our congregants to do? And I'd like to ask Gershom to respond first, and then we'll take turns.
Okay, the first thing I will say is I'm wary of using the word solution. One of my favorite interviewees turned mentors, the political scientist Yaron Ezrahi, once said to me that in politics there are not solutions, there are arrangements. There are better and worse arrangements. So I try, when I don't get sucked into the rhetoric of solutions, to talk about a one-state arrangement and a two-state arrangement and which one is better. I'm not going to try to answer here the whole question of what it means to withdraw, because when I wrote a chapter for a book edited by former Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer called Pathways to Peace 4 years ago, it took me 10,000 words to answer that question in very compressed form. And when he asked me to cut, I couldn't do it. So I'm simply going to say the name of the book.
We'll ask people to stay on for, until Havdalah, and we can.
Right. It is Pathways to Peace. It's edited by Daniel Kurtzer. And there's one chapter in there that deals with Israeli public attitudes and withdrawal. When you ask what people mean by the one-state solution, I think that there's a lot of confusion on that, and I think that many people, particularly abroad, aren't really sure what they mean by that. Some people who say that mean, okay, tomorrow, in principle, Israel will annex what are now the occupied territories. Everybody will have the vote. Everybody will be citizens. One person, one vote. Gorgeous. We've achieved freedom and equality, and everything is fine. The problem with that perception is that the day after tomorrow, when you hold your elections, you're going to have a parliament which is divided more or less equally between Jews and Palestinians. And every question which is now on the diplomatic table is going to, except for borders, is going to have to be divided, adjudicated by the political system of that new state. Refugees, holy places, the whole geschmai. In the best case, that would be Belgium, which doesn't work. And in the worst and more likely case, it would be Bosnia in the 90s. Some people on each side, when they talk about a one-state outcome, are really talking about a Palestinian state in which Jews will live, or a Jewish state in which Palestinians will live. And I think that for fairly obvious reasons, both of those conceptions are fairly unrealistic. And with all of the prices that I have described in that book involved in creating a two-state outcome, to quote the movie Argo, it's still the best bad plan we have.
Yofi, toda rabba. I want to turn it over to Rabbi Marmur to respond to the questions I review, and feel free to comment.
So the first thing I'll say in response to this question about, my distinction between myths and facts is that I don't think it's a bad idea to confront ourselves and the folks who are listening to us with the notion that the ideas, think about the discourse in the United States of America at the moment between liberals and conservatives. Admittedly, that discourse has got kind of complex right now, but it doesn't hurt to encourage folks to take a moment and consider the basis of our own assumptions, the way in which we put the world together. It doesn't hurt because it may induce within us a greater degree of empathy and understanding for somebody who comes at this from a different way. But it also may, and this is why I brought that text from Sikta Rabati about teshuvah. I'm trying to think now of teshuvah in relation to our myths. What does it mean to go? There's a wonderful book by Mircea Eliade, the great scholar of comparative religion and amateur anti-Semite, who wrote a book called, that may have been a professional occupation, I don't know, but he wrote a book called Cosmos and History, which he subtitled The Myth of the Eternal Return. And he has this fantastic examination of how in many cultures there is this idea of this great myth, in fact, this great story in which we're coming back to the source. Here I'm saying that as urbane, intelligent, educated liberals, maybe part of our teshuvah this year is coming back to the basis of our own myths. Those folks who I alluded to earlier, who have come out this year, we're not going to get mentioning them by names and so forth, but who've come and declared to the world that they used to think Israel was great and now they think Israel is terrible, are doing, they may think that they're doing tshuva, they're certainly doing al-chet, right? They're in a very public way banging their breast, beating their breasts, but it's not the teshuvah necessarily I have in mind.
When you get here. All right.
Please remain on mute until, thank you.
Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that what's the point of pointing out the interrelationship between myths and facts? I think if it challenges people intellectually, but also calls them, dare I say, spiritually or religiously, to think, what would it mean to go back to my core instincts and affiliations, and to try to examine where they come from, to challenge them to some degree, but also to affirm them. I think that is, a place for our teshuvah in a rather complicated world. So the question can always be asked: well, what have you done by pointing out a distinction? A good distinction is one that leaves you uncomfortable and challenged and thinking about what the applications might be. I'm not the person to provide a sort of heartwarming homily in which it turns out that if we just do X or Y, then everything will be okay, because I haven't encountered either X nor indeed Y.
Toda Rabba. In the interest of time, well, there are many questions, and please feel free, if you have other questions, to submit them to Rabbi Marmur, to Gershom Gorenberg, after the call. I'm happy to help facilitate that. I want to end with one question for both speakers that came in from Rabbi Andy Dubin. As Israelis, what do you think is the proper and most effective role that American Jews can play in helping to create a noble future for the state of Israel? Essentially, what can be our role, and if there is any action item that might be recommended, what would you offer?
If I can start, the first thing I would offer is you can't buy out. You can't get out of this question, even by saying nothing, because silence becomes a statement, and not necessarily the statement that you want. Because, as we know, there is in Israel, and there are groups that that claim to speak, particularly inside the Beltway, for American Jewry. And if you're comfortable with what they're saying, then that's not a problem. But if you disagree with what they're saying, and you say nothing, you have essentially given your proxy to them to speak for you, so you've made the statement that you didn't want to make. You can't get out of this one. It's uncomfortable. It's, it may not be what you like, but it's like many other things that we were born into. You're stuck with it. The second thing I would say is, and this goes along with what we heard before, is you have to learn a lot. There's a tremendous amount, you'll excuse me for saying so, of simplistic descriptions of what's going on here. And you need to learn enough that you're more confused than that. If you can answer the question of what's going on in Israel on one foot, then you really do need to go and study. The third thing is that I think that the biggest thing that I think it's obvious that the two biggest ways in which American Jewry from the sidelines affect what's going on in Israel are through the American political process and through the money that they give. So you should be involved with whichever group it is that is trying to influence the American government to move in whatever direction after your complex thinking and during your complex thinking that you think that Israel should move in. There should not be one voice inside the Beltway. And when you give, it's better to give with choices and to give to those groups or group that you think is promoting the kind of Israel that you want to see.
Toda Rabba. Michael?
I agree with everything that Gershom said, and I don't think it's necessary for me, just to show you how much I agree with it, to reiterate all of it. I will maybe just expand on the first point that he made. I think it's incredibly for our colleagues to step away from this question. It's not just for reasons of confusion. There sometimes are very strong political, tactical, strategic reasons why anything you say is going to enrage one or other constituency that you're keen not to enrage, because you're trying to hold the community together, because you want to have a broad tent, because you want to have a capital campaign, because, who knows what other reasons. But I do believe that a kind of paralysis, which leads us talking about on my list of bad sermons, there are lots of sermons that tell me things I didn't need to come to a sermon to hear. So when it turns out that life is a journey and a pageant and we should be nice to each other and so on, I'm delighted to hear that, but I really don't feel that I needed my my rabbi to tell me that without some value added that she or he can provide. So in this case, when Gershom says you can't duck this, it may be tempting to think that you can, but rather than duck it, to find the channel. Some of our colleagues, it's all about the wall. Are you in this part of the wall? Are you in this thing? Is it going to be here? Did somebody throw a bag of crap at you? Did they swear? People get very excited about the wall thing. That's fine if that's what's going to do it for you. For some people, it's about a project, be it a big political project or an on-the-ground thing, a philanthropic direction. I hardly care in a sense, but some conduit through which you can bring all of your passion and talent. I think to model apathy, confusion, and distance is the worst thing that one can do. Instead, what we want to model is this myth of eternal return. I've come away from it. I'm on the far side of the orbit of this topic. I'm coming back to it. I'm going to try and address it again and to see how I can relate to these complexities in a new and interesting way.
Toda Rabba. Before we end the call, I just want to thank you both personally on behalf of ARZA. I also want to thank Rabbi Neil Gold for organizing today's call, along with our partners in the CCAR. I want to take away those notions of being a conduit of learning, of not being apathetic, being involved, and being active on these issues. To end our session today, I want to invite two leaders, Rabbi Janet Liss from the CCR Israel Committee and Rabbi Judy Schindler, the co-chair of the ARZA Rabbinic Council, to offer words of closing.
I'll begin just by reiterating the same thanks that Josh has given to both Michael and Gershom, and Josh for organizing this call. We really appreciate having the opportunity to hear from all of you and to learn from you today. And thank you for inspiring us.
And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we had close to 60 people on this call, which says an incredible amount about the centrality of Israel in all of our lives. And in closing, I want to invite you all to be part of the ARZA Rabbinic Council. And the council aims to put on high caliber programs like we did today. And we have several teams, a program team that will create programming, an editorial team that will create Yunim and a journal of writing about Reform Zionism, and a partnership mentoring program, which will enable rabbis of different generations to work together and strengthen the work of Israel engagement for all clergy. So we hope you'll join the Rabbinic Council, and our theme for this year is the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War and the multifaceted nature of this milestone. Throughout the course of this year, especially in the spring, the world will be engaged in this conversation, and we want to prepare all of us to enter this conversation and hopefully even to lead this conversation. So we hope you'll join us. This ARZA Rabbinic Council is our place, our forum, our safe haven where we can struggle with issues, debate, learn, and grow together. So may we continue this conversation.
Amen. Toda Rabba and Shana Tova, almost. This will end the broadcasting, and we will send out a link of the recorded session shortly.